Hi, it's Miss Bierman, and today we are going to use acrylic paint on a magnet. We are upcycling a magnet. The magnet has been painted on the front with 2 layers of gesso or primer. So you're going to be working on the white side. The back side is the magnetic part. You'll see the gesso in some places may be a bit thin, and you see some of the imagery that was originally on the magnet underneath. And don't worry, that will eventually get covered up. So the gesso is on there, so the acrylic paint has something to stick to. If you just try to put paint directly on the magnet, the surface was way too slick, and the paint, it'd be really difficult to get that paint to stick well. So on that gessoed surface, you would use a pencil to start sketching out your design. You will notice as I draw that I make many lines, very sketchy. And the reason I do that is because I like to find the line. So I have all these lines, and then as I keep drawing, I decide which line is the one I should keep, and then I start erasing the ones that I don't want. You may also notice as I erase that the graphite or so-called lead of the pencil does smear around, and that's normal. As you paint, you'll be covering that graphite up, so don't worry about it too much. Now, here's a step that is completely optional. I am tracing this with a thin Sharpie. As I was saying before, I'm trying to find the lines, and now I am putting in my final lines. I have to say, though, it didn't work super great using that thin Sharpie because it was kind of ruining the tip of the Sharpie because the surface is somewhat rough. So, just a warning there. So I will continue here to use my Sharpie to find the lines. You will see that, I'm maybe even making some new lines as well. And then using that eraser to get off as much of that graphite as possible. It does smear around a bit. You've got these acrylic paints that come in these little pots. Make sure you've got some brushes, some water. Put something underneath my magnet so I wouldn't get paint all over the table. And I can also use that as open up the little paint, and I'm just sort of testing the color. And what I noticed is that I wanted it to be a little less transparent. So I'm using some yellow with some white, of course, dark into light, so yellow into white. And I did that because it will make the paint a little more solid looking. Now I will go and do a second coat later. And when I do the second coat, I'm not going to use that light yellow. I wasn't even sure how effective that really was. So when I went to the orange, I just used the orange straight up. Every time you switch colors, you need to wash your brush thoroughly, and you need to dry it on a paper towel. If you are double dipping into different colors, you're going to mess your paints up pretty quickly. We do not have extra paints for you to use, so you have to be careful how much you are using. We'll be doing 2 coats. Acrylic paint by nature can be somewhat transparent. It depends on the colors you're using. This red that I'm using, you can still see the Sharpie lines underneath, so that should give you an indication of the transparency of the paint. Trying to make kind of a bluish gray color and I was trying to use that light yellow. It didn't quite work out. I needed to find a different blue. As I paint, I try and keep those lids on the colors that I'm not using, and I keep my little paint pots in the plastic container that it came in. So I highly advise you to do those things so that you don't lose your little paint pots. If you leave one open, it's going to dry out. You have to be very careful to make sure they're all shut. The great thing about acrylic paint is it dries fairly quickly, and you can typically layer colors over each other. You'll notice the little finger, I painted a little bit of blue on top of it, but that's okay because I'm going to go back in with some red later. Now we are seeing the second coat. So I worked on the red and the blue, let the orange and the yellow dry while I did that, and then I'm going to use just the regular yellow this time over that light yellow. It helps make it more vivid, more bright. So I'm working on the second coat and finding that I like the way the yellow works when it's over that lighter yellow. However, there is one Sharpie line at the bottom that I can't really cover up with the yellow, but that's okay. So here goes my second coat of red. You can see how it looks much more rich and saturated once I get that second coat in. You can see now I'm filling that little finger back in, and as you're painting, just keep remembering, put the lids on those paints when they're not in use. I'm working on a shade now, a reddish kind of shade, and when you add black to a color, it can be very powerful. I put a little bit too much in. So I added a little bit more red to my palette / messy mat and found a sort of a maroon color that I'm satisfied with. So using that color to do some of the shadows. I continue to use the red or maroon color to create shadows in the body. I did look at a picture for reference. I can't make this guy just from my head, but you'll notice that I'm outlining some parts of the red body, and I'm not using black, I'm using that dark red color. It helps make it look three-dimensional, but also not such a harsh line. In your paint kit, you got one brush. It's a flat brush. It works really well. For sometimes small details, you'll need a smaller brush. That I made, you'll see in a little bit, I put too much water in it. You can kind of see how it's still shiny there on the visor. Highlights. Happy with the color or the consistency of the darker blue on the visor. So blotting it. And when I blotted it, the paper towel to make sure it doesn't have any other paint on it. Blotted that really liquidy blue, it shows some of the darker color underneath, and I really like that. So it was definitely a discovery. And tell people they ought to paint the background first, the end, so that I could clean up the best that I can using my flat brush. All of your paints, lids on, throw away your messy mat, and there you have it. I am not the imposter.